Welcome to the Global War Watch Network. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something huge. How global conflicts have changed over time. We're looking at the whole arc, from the end of World War II, that incredible devastation, right up to the really complex, tangled challenges we're seeing now. We've gone through a ton of material history books, academic papers, recent global reports trying to pull out the key insights for you. Our goal, to help you get a handle on what defines these different eras of war, how things have shifted, and, well, what it all means for us today.
Yeah, we'll try to connect those dots, past and present. Hopefully uncover some things you might not have known and give that bigger picture context for why these changes really matter. It might make you rethink some common ideas about war and peace.
Okay, let's jump in. World War II. I mean, the scale was just unprecedented, the human cost unimaginable. But its end didn't exactly bring about world peace, did it? What did that immediate aftermath look like?
No, not even close. What's really fascinating, I think, is how that period right after the war didn't just wrap things up. It actually set the stage for completely new kinds of power struggles and future conflicts.
And economically, socially, just think about the UK. They won, technically, but they were facing severe hardship. They'd spent something like, what, tens of billions in today's money just on aircraft, really stretched thin until the U.S. Lend-Lease aid came through?
Right, and then you look at the United States, totally different story. Their industry wasn't bombed, civilians were largely spared, and their GDP just exploded. It was called an economic expansion unseen in human history. And this wasn't just, the U.S. doing well. It fundamentally created a new global financial setup. American economic power basically propped up the whole Western bloc. That shift, huge implications for the ideological fights to come.
And beyond just the money, there were some really morally gray areas emerging too, like how the Allies treated Japanese soldiers afterwards. They weren't always classified as POWs, but as Japanese Surrendered Personnel, JSP. And they were used for forced labor until 1947, even by the UK, France, the Netherlands. What does that tell us about, the complexities of winning a war like that?
That's a really stark point about the JSP. It shows the harsh reality often hidden behind the official narratives of rebuilding. And these things, the economic shifts, the ethical ambiguities, they fed directly into new political divisions, almost immediately. The Soviet Union, for instance, didn't waste time. They annexed territory or turned countries like Poland, Hungary, East Germany into Soviet republics, expanding their sphere of influence deep into Europe. They grabbed Sakhalin Island, too. Yugoslavia was interesting, though. Under Tito, they managed to stay communist but independent, not directly under Moscow's thumb.
And on the Allied side, you had these big administrative bodies set up. The Far Eastern Commission for Japan, the Allied Control Council for Germany, basically running the occupations.
Exactly. And connecting that to the bigger picture, the old League of Nations was finished. The United Nations was founded instead. But look at how it was structured. The Security Council, the real power center, gave permanent seats and veto power to the five main Allied victors, the US, UK, France, Soviet Union, and China, which later became the PRC. Then Russia, of course. Why? Well, it directly mirrored who actually held power in this new world order. No ambiguity there.
So the world was fractured, economically, socially, politically, but these weren't just separate issues. They quickly hardened into something else entirely, the Cold War. So what defined this new type of war?
The Cold War, yeah.
Yeah.
Roughly 1947 to 91, it was this global face-off, mainly U.S. versus USSR, but critically, they largely avoided direct fighting between themselves. Instead, it played out everywhere else. Proxy wars, intense spying, economic warfare, a constant battle of ideologies, all driven by this deep, deep mutual suspicion.
Right, so the U.S. strategy became containment, starting with the Truman Doctrine in 47, stop communism from spreading. And then the Marshall Plan pouring billions, maybe close to $190 billion in today's terms, into Western Europe. Rebuilding economies, yes, but also building alliances, wasn't it?
Precisely. That economic aid absolutely helped solidify those alliances. It led straight to NATO forming in 1949 a military pact against potential Soviet aggression. And the Soviets responded with their own bloc, a Warsaw Pact, in 1955. There's that famous quote from Lord Ismay about NATO's goal: to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Kind of sums up the complex anxieties of the time, doesn't it?
Meanwhile, behind the scenes, this incredible shadow war was heating up. Soviet spies actually got inside the Manhattan Project. That's
Right.
mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And it meant the USSR got their own atomic bomb in 49, way faster than the U.S. expected. Then the U.S. had its Venona Project, uncovering widespread Soviet spying in America. That level of infiltration and deception, it's chilling. How did people even live with that constant nuclear threat hanging over them?
That's a great question, because the threat felt truly existential. Eisenhower's whole strategy of massive retaliation was based on the U.S. being willing to launch a nuclear strike.
Mm.
We now know from declassified plans from the late 50s that the U.S. targeted something like 1,200 cities in the Soviet bloc and China for systematic destruction, Moscow, Beijing included.
Mm.
It forced this huge psychological shift. The Cold War wasn't just defined by battles fought, but by the catastrophe that could happen any minute, mutually assured destruction. That shadow hung over everything.
And this Cold War wasn't just fought with spies and threats, it spilled onto actual battlefields, just not directly between the superpowers. Lots of newly independent countries became these third world battlefields, caught in the middle.
Exactly. These proxy wars became the main event in many ways. Look at Korea, 1950 to 53. North Korea invades the South, the UN steps in, which was only possible because the Soviets were boycotting the Security Council right then. Kind of an ironic twist.
Right.
Then China jumps in, pushes the UN forces back, and you end up with the stalemate at the 38th parallel that's still there today.
Right. And Vietnam.
Yeah, French Indochina first. The Viet Minh's fight for independence beat the French at Dien Bien Phu in 54. Then the U.S. gets drawn in, supporting South Vietnam against the Communist North. A long, brutal conflict. Cuba, too. The revolution in 59. Then the missile crisis in 62. That was probably the closest we ever came to actual nuclear war. U.S. missiles in Europe, Soviet missiles suddenly in Cuba. Incredibly tense.
Wow. And Afghanistan.
Afghanistan in 79, the Soviet invasion, that turned into a total quagmire for them. Muslim guerrillas, the Mujahideen, got help from the U.S., China, the U.K., Saudis, Pakistan. A lot of people called it the Soviets' Vietnam War.
So after all that, there was that period of detente in the 70s, a bit of a thaw. But it fell apart, especially after Afghanistan. Then Reagan comes in, the evil empire talk, a massive U.S. military buildup in the 80s. How did all that pressure lead to the end?
Well, that pressure, especially the economic pressure, was key. The Soviet military spending. It was crippling, maybe up to a quarter of their entire economy. It just worsened the deep economic rot that was already there. Then you have Gorbachev trying to reform the system with glasnost and perestroika, opening things up. And then events just cascaded. The INF Treaty cutting nuclear missiles, the Berlin Wall coming down in 89 is a powerful symbol. The Malta Summit, where Bush and Gorbachev basically declared the Cold War over. German reunification. The Startagiti reducing nuclear arsenals in 91. And finally, on Christmas Day 1991, the Soviet Union itself just dissolved.
So the Cold War ends. Does that mean conflict itself ends? Or does it just
Yeah.
change shape again?
It definitely changes shape. Paradoxically, the Cold War, with its rigid bipolar structure, had actually imposed a kind of stability, freezing many potential conflicts. When that ended, the lid came off. You saw the immediate violent breakup of Yugoslavia, the Balkan Wars through the 90s, and that forced NATO to evolve too. It went from being a deterrent force to actively intervening peacekeeping, airstrikes in Bosnia in 95, Kosovo in 99, a totally new role.
So the big superpower standoff fades, but then we see a rise in these internal conflicts, civil wars. What makes these conflicts tick? Why are they so persistent?
Right. A civil war is basically a war within a country. Organized groups fighting for control or policy changes. And what's striking is just how many have happened since World War II. I think the figures show about half of all recorded civil wars since the early 1800s actually happened between 1944 and 1997. They really proliferated in the post-war and especially post-Cold War era.
And when academics try to figure out the causes, there's this big debate, right? Greed versus grievance. Is it mostly about money and resources, or is it deeper stuff? Ethnicity, religion, historical wrongs?
Yeah, that's the classic framing. And the research, well, it suggests economic and structural things often have more statistical weight, though grievances are obviously real and powerful motivators too. Like the Collier-Hoefler model, which is pretty influential, argues that civil war is less likely when young men, especially, have better economic options. Higher school enrollment, better incomes, economic growth. It raises the cost of rebellion, less to gain, more to lose by fighting. What's also really interesting is the role of diasporas communities living outside the country. The research found that having a large diaspora significantly increased the risk of civil war, potentially sixfold, mainly because they can fund the rebellions from abroad.
So it's not just internal factors. Money flowing in from outside can be a huge driver.
Absolutely. Now, on the grievance side, it's complex. Just having lots of different ethnic or religious groups didn't strongly correlate with war overall. But ethnic dominance, where one group is a clear majority, did nearly double the risk. Suggests it's more about power imbalances than diversity itself. Of course, critics rightly point out that these big models can be too simple. Real conflicts are incredibly messy, driven by personal histories and specific local factors that statistics don't always capture. You need that human perspective too.
Okay, and another huge factor seems to be the nature of the states themselves, especially those formed after colonialism ended.
Definitely. Decolonization often left behind what political scientists call weak or fragile states. They had independence on paper, de jure sovereignty, but often lacked the strong institutions, the economic base, the real control de facto sovereignty that Western nations had developed over centuries.
And here's a really counterintuitive finding. International policies meant to help actually might have backfired sometimes. Like development aid and the world saying no secession actually correlated with more civil war.
It's a controversial point, but yeah, some analysis suggests that. The strong international norm against secession, coupled with aid flows that could be captured by warring factions, may have inadvertently removed incentives to compromise and prolong conflicts between 1945 and 1997. It's complex, but suggests good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes.
Can you give us some examples, maybe from post-colonial Africa?
Sure. Rwanda in 1994 is a horrific example. The roots go back to Belgian colonial rule, which favored the Tutsi minority over the Hutu majority for decades, building deep resentment. The immediate spark was the president's plane being shot down in April 94, but that unleashed a pre-planned genocide by Hutu extremists against Tutsis and moderate Hutus. Just devastating. Or look at Nigeria. Very complex. You have the Niger Delta conflict, partly about political power, religion, but hugely about oil resources. They tried an amnesty program which had mixed results, but maybe did reduce the worst of the violence for a time. And then there's Boko Haram in the northeast, a different kind of threat, religious extremism wanting to impose Islamic law, rejecting Western influence, attacking the state, civilians, UN buildings, churches, just brutal violence like that Christmas Day bombing in 2011 that killed dozens. Shows the multiple types of internal conflict a single country can face.
And it's rarely just internal, is it? Outsiders often get involved.
Very often. Something like two-thirds of internal conflicts between WWII and 2000 saw some kind of international intervention. The U.S. alone intervened in about 35 of them. Does intervention work? It's really hard to say definitively because countries don't intervene randomly. They pick specific situations. But some studies suggest peacekeeping can be effective when you account for that bias. On the flip side, other studies show that simply providing military aid to one side can sometimes just make the violence worse. So intervention is a double-edged sword.
Okay, so that brings us more or less up to the present day. Given all this history, world wars, Cold Wars, civil wars, where do we stand now? Is the world getting more dangerous or less?
Well, the data right now is sobering. We're actually seeing the highest number of countries involved in conflicts since the end of World War II. And the economic cost is massive. In 2023, the global impact of violence was estimated at $19.1 trillion. It's about $2,380 for every person on the planet. A lot of that increase is due to the economic damage caused by conflict itself.
$19 trillion. Wow. Where are the global hotspots and where are things relatively calm, according to the latest indices?
The Global Peace Index still ranks Iceland as the most peaceful has been since 2008. Then you have Ireland, Austria, New Zealand, Singapore doing well. At the other end, Yemen is now considered the least peaceful, overtaking Afghanistan. Then Sudan, South Sudan, Afghanistan, and Ukraine are sadly right down there. The Middle East and North Africa, MENA, remains the least peaceful region overall, home to 4 of the bottom 10 countries.
And beyond the number of conflicts, you mentioned earlier the nature of war itself is changing. How so?
Yes, that's critical. Conflicts seem to be getting more internationalized, more outside actors involved, like we discussed with interventions and proxies. And this actually makes them harder to solve. Think about it. The percentage of wars ending in a clear victory has plummeted. It was almost 50% in the 1970s. Now it's less than 9%. And peace agreements are way down too, from around 23% to just over 4%. Conflicts are becoming more drawn out, messier, less likely to end decisively.
And technology plays a huge role there, especially asymmetric warfare tech. Drones seem to be everywhere now.
Absolutely everywhere. Drones are a perfect example. Between 2018 and 2023, the number of countries using drones went up 150%. But get this, the number of non-state groups, militias, insurgents, etc., carrying out at least one drone attack, that jumped by over 1,400%. It's an explosion. And what it means is that the technological barrier to entry for sophisticated violence has dropped dramatically. Smaller groups can now challenge much larger states in ways they couldn't before. It totally changes the battlefield dynamic and makes achieving stability much harder.
And looking at current crises, like Gaza.
The Gaza war has had a huge impact. Israel's peace ranking dropped to its lowest ever, 155th. Palestine has seen the biggest decline over the last decade. That conflict isn't contained either. It's destabilizing the entire Middle East, raising fears of wider war, and the economic fallout is spreading. We saw how Syria's economy shrank by over 85% after its civil war started. Ukraine lost nearly 30% of its economy in the year after the 2022 invasion. Conflict is economically devastating.
With all this going on, what's happening with military spending globally? Is it shooting up?
It is. Militarization increased in 91 countries after the Ukraine war began, reversing a 15-year downward trend. And frankly, it doesn't look likely to improve soon. Interestingly, while actual troop numbers have decreased in many places over the last decade, overall military capability is up by over 10%. Why? Technology. Sophistication matters more than sheer numbers now, and new research confirms the U.S. still has significantly higher military capability than China, with Russia following closely behind them.
Any quick regional snapshots?
Europe is still the most peaceful region overall, but it saw the biggest jump in military spending last year because of Ukraine. North America actually got slightly less peaceful due to violent crime and fear levels, and sub-Saharan Africa is facing major security challenges, especially political instability and terrorism, particularly in the Sahel region.
It's really striking when you lay it all out like that, how fundamentally conflict has morphed since World War II. From those massive state-on-state wars, through the ideological standoff of the Cold War with its proxy fights, and now into this era dominated by internal conflicts, often fueled by outside actors and amplified by tech like drones, the rulebook keeps changing.
It really does, and it underlines that peace isn't just about preventing World War III anymore. It's about tackling this incredibly complex web of internal strife, regional rivalries, fragile states, and new technologies that are constantly reshaping the landscape, causing immense suffering and huge economic waste. The challenge is so much broader now.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, our listener. Considering everything we've discussed today, the history, the economics, the technology, the human factors, what do you think is the single most important, but perhaps most overlooked, driver of conflict in our world right now? Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive into the evolution of global conflict. We hope we gave you some new things to think about, maybe some surprising facts on what is obviously a really complex and vital subject.
Thanks for tuning in to the deep dive. It was great discussing this.
Please do like, share, and subscribe to the Global War Watch Network if you found this useful. And we genuinely want to hear your perspective on that last question or anything else from today. Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. Until next time.